This is the concluding chapter of The Communist Road to Capitalism by Ralf Ruckus. I'm not going to read the whole book because I've kind of decided that that's kind of stressful and that not that many people watch the final or listen to the final chapters of a book. So I think I'm just from this point forward just going to do essays and short pieces and then, you know, just that. Anywhooser, the title of the chapter is Getting Over Actually Existing Socialism. Using a narrative matrix that visualizes periods and subperiods of PRC history to describe the CCP rule over the past 70 years, this book follows particular historical patterns of social unrest and regime countermeasures, with special attention paid to class and gender relations. The first section of these conclusions recaps the two concepts narrative matrix and the historical pattern. The first section of these conclusions recaps the two concepts narrative matrix and historical pattern before returning to contradictory left-wing positions about PRC history discussed in the introductory chapter. The second section assesses two factors that make systemic change from below possible today: the multiple crises the CCP regime is currently experiencing, and the historical window created by global systemic instability. The third section discusses some of the broader implications and political lessons for the left that can be drawn from the trajectory of the PRC's socialism and transition to capitalism. In the final part, it proposes forms of engagement in and support of social struggles in the PRC and elsewhere. Section 1. Recapitulation. Concepts revisited. Several left-wing positions regarding the PRC's historical trajectory since 1949 were described in this book's introduction, followed by questions and hypotheses, as well as a choice of particular perspectives to be pursued. The inquiry has revealed a specific historical pattern of 4 periods and a number of subperiods, and the sequence of these periods and subperiods is visualized in a narrative matrix that serves as the basic structure for the remaining book chapters. This section revisits the narrative matrix, the historical patterns, and left-wing positions on PRC history in reverse order and highlights the advantages and limitations of this inquiry in order to critically reflect what the left can learn from it for future inquiries and actions. Narrative matrix. The matrix used in this book is a narrative tool that visualizes the sequential periods of antagonism between the ruling class and the exploited classes in PRC history since 1949. It shows the political, social, and economic dynamics in the socialist and capitalist period, as well as in the periods of transition. The first column underlying continuities that include gradual changes, CCP rule, the authoritarian state and repression, exploitative surplus extraction, labor hierarchy and social exclusions, the rural-urban divide, the migration regime, and the patriarchal order and gendered oppression. The second column presents the periods: transition to socialism, socialism, transition to capitalism, capitalism, which are defined by major ruptures of social and political dynamics. The third and fourth columns describe and specify each subperiod as a specific instance of unrest or containment and reform. The matrix helps to better understand the dynamics of social unrest and regime countermeasures, yet it has its limitations too. For instance, the classification of sequential periods, top to bottom, suggests a straight and the things where it says like top to bottom and stuff like that is in relation to this like chart that they have here, but I'm not going to read through the chart. For instance, the classification of sequential periods, table top to bottom, suggests a straight and clear historical direction, but this is an illusion. The long transition from socialism to capitalism in particular was not only gradual and intermittent, but also ambivalent and contradictory. The sequence of two subperiods during each period, socialism, the transition to capitalism, and capitalism, describe historical swings from social unrest to containment and reform and back. Footnote. Although of a shorter term, this dynamic is similar to Karl Polanyi's pendulum that swings back and forth between a phase of regulation and a phase of deregulation, or unleashing of capitalist market forces, also described as embedding and unembedding. In this book, the pendulum is depicted from a grassroots angle. It swings back and forth between a phase of social discontent and struggle and a phase of ruling class countermeasures and reforms. End of footnote. However, many of these subperiods overlapped, as unrest from below was often vibrant and erratic, and took years to develop and grow, while containment measures and reforms from above were also staggered and long-lasting. Rather than a clear and straight line of development, the trajectory followed a dashed and wavy line. The book's inquiry neither addresses China's history before the founding of the PRC in 1949, nor does it provide any prognostication about where things will go after 2020. Adding earlier periods, i.e., the imperial and the republican era, and the rise of the CCP in the 1920s and 30s, could reveal whether these periods also exhibited variations in the interplay between unrest and containment or reform. Similarly, it would be interesting to discuss whether we are today entering or have already entered another transitional or even post-capitalist period. If it started with a wave of unrest from below like the previous main periods, the uprising in Hong Kong in 2019 and persistent social discontent in the PRC could be portent of such a new wave. Will that kind of unrest be followed by new containment, or will it escalate and go beyond the pattern of swings between unrest and containment, shattering the format of the matrix used here? We have to see. Historical patterns. If we want to make use of the past experiences in the PRC to prepare for future attempts to topple capitalism and create a very different and much better version of socialism, we need to understand the patterns of class struggle, the specific forms of social unrest along different fronts, in production, reproduction, and other social terrains, and the countermeasures by the ruling class and the state. The repeated waves of social unrest from below in the PRC were rooted in anger, dissatisfaction, and discontent due to unfulfilled promises, effects of collectivization, work pressure and exploitation, cadre arbitrariness and corruption, inequality, and gender discrimination. Protesters' criticism and demands included equality, dignity, democracy, freedom, and material improvements. Different protagonists were involved in the struggle: workers, migrants, peasants, students, and women. Their format varied somewhere between single events and larger cycles or waves, and they featured different means such as strikes, public voicing of criticism, underground literature, demonstrations, and violent revolts. Equally important, but not a focus of this book, are more covert forms of social resistance, the quote, weapons of the weak, which is a reference, according to this footnote, to James C. Scott's Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance. The titles of the first and third sections in chapter 2 to 4 represent the changing forms of struggle that dominated the respective periods: disruption, rebellion, discontent, uprising, resistance, and strikes. The instance of larger social unrest during the socialist period, the 100 Flowers movement, and the Cultural Revolution were unleashed from above and had the support of part of the CCP leadership, while still challenging the regime politically. These rebellions spun out of control at some point as the result of unexpected discontent and criticism from below. The political nature of Maoism as the CCP's main political guide plays a role here. Different from Stalinism in the Soviet Union and socialist countries in Eastern Europe, the CCP used frequent mass mobilizations to achieve economic and political goals. These mobilizations involved critique of socialist bureaucratism or capitalist voters in the CCP leadership, and therefore risked escalation of social unrest and mass protests that could turn against the regime, as in the mid-1950s and mid-1960s. The instances of unrest during the transitional period, the April 5th movement and the Democracy Wall movement in the second part of the 1970s, as well as the Tiananmen Square movement in 1989, constituted major political challenges for the regime. Although they developed from below at first, they gained the support of particular groups in the leadership that saw the potential to co-opt the movements for their own factional and reformist purposes. The instances of unrest during the capitalist period, the state-owned enterprise workers and peasants' discontent, as well as the migrant workers' strikes, were initiated from below. The first is a mainly defensive struggle to safeguard the socialist iron rice bowl, and concerned guarantees for rural inhabitants. The second is a more offensive struggle for material improvements, acknowledgement, and dignity for migrant workers. Different from the earlier waves of unrest, they both remained limited to the socio-economic level and did not become serious political threats for the central regime. Reasons for this are the increasing commodification or market character of large parts of the economy. Even the state-owned enterprises are largely run as profit-oriented companies that compete for labor power in markets, and the greater separation of political and economic spheres. Social struggles targeted mainly the economic, private, and state-controlled capitalist players, as well as local state and party officials, but not the central CCP and state leadership. This might change now as the current CCP regime has strengthened the role of the party and the state in the economy and re-centralized decision-making and responsibilities, thereby making the central CCP regime less flexible and more vulnerable to criticism and subversion from below. The titles of the second and fourth sections in chapters 2 to 4 represent the changing forms of containment or reform carried out by the CCP leadership to deal with the unrest in their respective periods. Speed up, restoration, reform, resumption, consolidation, and expansion. The countermeasures differed in extent, duration, and combination of repression, concession, and co-optation to contain, channel, or suppress unrest. Repression took different forms, such as stigmatization, exclusion, quote, re-education, rustication, and imprisonment. More extensive efforts included the anti-rightist campaign in 1957, the state's attack on the rebels during and after the Cultural Revolution, and the crackdown against the Tiananmen Square movement in 1989. In the last two cases, the CCP leadership was challenged to the point that it had to fight for its survival by calling in the military to crush the movements. Occasionally, the regime made partial concessions and tried to channel discontent into official mechanisms in an effort to pacify the unrest. Examples of such partial concessions were the unemployment benefits and employment schemes of the state-owned enterprise workers in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the wage increases for migrant workers after their waves of struggle started in the mid-2000s. Last but not least, at times, the CCP regime used the co-optation of demands and actors who were willing to change sides, a way to weaken discontent and make use of popular demands that actually made the whole system more stable. Examples include the integration of Cultural Revolution rebel leaders into the CCP leadership in the late 1960s, and later, the adoption of demands for reforms made during the Democracy Wall movement in the late 1970s by the CCP leadership under Deng Xiaoping. Containment efforts were regularly followed by reforms from above. Large regime efforts to avoid further discontent by abolishing its social Containment efforts were regularly followed by reforms from above, large regime efforts to avoid further discontent by abolishing its social or political roots and by stabilizing both the economy and the political structures. For instance, the mobilization of workers and peasants for the Great Leap Forward and the change of economic structures during the reform and opening after 1978. Depending on the forms and results of the containment, the stage of economic development and crisis and global factors, the reforms had a different, more or less offensive or defensive character that is also reflected in the titles for the respective subperiods. On the domestic level, particularly new class compositions, leadership conflicts, and technological changes were critical in defining the shape of the reform in a certain subperiod. On the global level, dynamics such as worldwide economic crises, the Cold War, major changes in the global socialist movement, and waves of revolt and uprisings in different world regions influenced the course of the reform. Left-wing positions. As described in the first section of the introduction, identifying specific historical patterns and formulating the narrative matrix that structures this book are motivated by evident differences between certain left-wing perspectives or positions on the PRC's trajectory. The first position considers the PRC as consistently socialist from 1949 until today. It glosses over the massive social, economic, and political transformations over the course of the past decades, including repeated changes in the composition and form of workers' and peasant struggles against the rulers, exploitation, gender discrimination, and so on. Supporters of this position often mistakenly understand state ownership, welfare, centralized one-party rule as tantamount to socialism or even communism. This view is rightly contested by other socialists after the beginning of the reform. This view is rightly contested by other sections of the global left. The characterization of the PRC as remaining socialist This view is rightly contested by other sections of the global left. The characterization of the PRC as remaining socialist after the beginning of the reform and opening in 1978, and even after the restructuring of the state sector in the mid-1990s, is indeed baseless. The PRC is clearly capitalist because it features important factors that define capitalist relations, all evident since the 1990s: the class conflict between those who control or own the means of production and those who do not, the extraction of surplus value and exploitation, the appropriation of profits by the recomposed ruling class of state and private players, and the expanded use of managed market mechanisms in the economy. The second position describes the entirety of the past 70 years in the PRC as a kind of capitalism or state capitalism, making a similar mistake. It glosses over real changes by using just one term or description for an assumed single and lasting period. Actually existing socialism and capitalism indeed share key features such as surplus extraction and accumulation, top-down labor organization, and social hierarchies. Yet, for a critique of the socialist experience, we need to recognize the differences between the two periods, namely during the socialist period, the existence of socialist planning institutions and planned allocation of labor and other resources, as well as the specific role of the CCP and state organs that created particular social relations between workers, peasants, migrants, and women, and the CCP regime. Needless to say, the PRC's actually existing socialism is far from what constitutes a classless society without exploitation and repression, and any new revolutionary attempt has to learn from the pitfalls of this past experience. The third position understands the PRC's pre-reform system before 1978 as a form of socialism and acknowledges the subsequent transition to capitalism after 1978, while some left-wing supporters of this position, including many Maoists, describe the PRC's socialism in the 1950s and 1960s in positive terms. Others, including many Trotskyists, consider it as a, quote, degenerated form of socialism. This book generally agrees with this third position, but has its own critique of actually existing socialism and formulates a variation or fourth position. This position highlights two transitional phases in the early 1950s, before the socialist period, and from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, before the capitalist period. Following the trajectory in these periods reveals how the economic, social, and political systems were gradually changed without the reversal of CCP rule. The CCP leadership proved extremely flexible when adapting its social, political, and ideological foundations and transforming the composition of its main forces from what was basically a peasant army into a socialist bureaucratic ruling class, and finally into a capitalist ruling class. The PRC's socialism of the 1950s and 1960s did not arrive at the envisioned revolutionary transitional system leading to communism, but led to a class society that combined elements also used in capitalism to develop or modernize. The PRC socialism of the 1950s and 1960s did not arrive at the envisioned revolutionary transitional system leading to communism, but led to a class society that combined elements also used in capitalism to develop or modernize the country through a planned economy under the CCP control. Protagonists of left-wing positions have different opinions on why the transition from socialism to capitalism took place. For instance, since the 1960s, different generations of Maoists have claimed that the so-called capitalist voters in the CCP leadership stood behind the transition. This position insinuates the existence of a general transition plan that was allegedly carried out from the mid-1960s or the late 1970s onward. There's no evidence for such a master plan, and blaming the transition mostly on deviant CCP leadership ignores structural factors both domestic and global. The road that started in the 1950s and might initially have been meant to lead to communism ended up as a detour that fundamentally changed the country and integrated it into the capitalist world system. This transition was neither planned nor contingent. Rather, it was the result of the structural features of the form of the CCP regime took in the 1950s and 1960s, and of social, political, and economic dynamics that made the transition to capitalism in the following decades possible and likely, though not inevitable. Section 2. Assessment. Historical opportunity. Before the next section looks at strategies for social movements and the left that could help avoid past mistakes and unleash a process that leads to the abolition of capitalism, this section takes up the question of whether the current conditions actually give rise to hope for such change. The first part discusses the economic, political, social, and ecological crises that threaten to further destabilize the CCP regime. The second part focuses on the current historical window created by global systemic instability, which offers the opportunity for change through struggles from below in the PRC and beyond. Crises in the PRC. The CCP leadership regularly emphasizes the need to protect regime stability and neutralize threats posed by economic crises or social upheavals. From a left-wing perspective, however, it is precisely regime instability that opens up possibilities for change as long as there are social forces that are able to use the instability and to push through actual improvements. What follows is a short summary of factors and developments that indicate that the CCP regime is, in fact, not as stable as the party leadership wants people in the PRC and elsewhere to believe. First, on the economic level, the PRC's further development has been threatened by labor shortages and by workers' struggles, which won wage increases and began to undermine the PRC's, quote, cheap labor model by the second half of the 2000s. The regime has tried to upgrade and rebalance the economy, produce higher valued goods, and reduce the dependency on exports. Both measures have been partially successful, but profitability and the rate of economic growth have both continued to fall. Structural imbalances have persisted, especially the major dependency on state investment to generate economic growth in forms of overaccumulation and underconsumption. Since the regime's massive stimulus program in reaction to the financial crisis after 2008, overall debt has increased immensely. Structural problems in the finance sector and the public taxation system added to the recurring debt problems of companies and municipalities. Second, in the face of domestic economic challenges, the regime has tried to increase its economic capacities abroad, for instance through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, another, quote, spatial fix. The economic results have been mixed. Some BRI projects have been completed and others are on hold or have failed. While BRI deals had to be renegotiated with indebted countries, the PRC government has put a brake on lending to other countries' governments, state banks, and state-owned companies. The trade war with the U.S. since 2018 is a symptom of the intensified economic and political rivalry between the old hegemon and the new challenger on the global level, and puts more economic pressure on the PRC. The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy in 2020 have led to yet another economic crisis and again massive state-sponsored stimulus programs, only to exacerbate the structural economic problems. Several factors might further undermine the PRC's economic development and lead to recession, debt, bankruptcies, unemployment, and stagnating or falling wages, a further deterioration in PRC-U.S. relations, headwinds from other countries' regimes that compete for profits and resources, the potential partial disintegration of the global economy, decoupling, and a deglobalization or reconfiguration of global supply chains. Third, threats to the PRC's cheap labor model also come from a different source. The country's economic rise was based on the reproduction and supply of rural labor, i.e. generations of migrants who moved to the urban and industrial areas to work in factories, on construction sites, and in low-wage service jobs. This supply has gradually dried up since the 2000s, despite a loosening of migration controls and the end of the one-child policy. Women have, in effect, been on a kind of birth strike in recent years, refusing to raise more than one child and ignoring calls from CCP leaders who have urged women to fulfill their, quote, patriotic duty to produce more children for the nation. This might lead to more labor shortages and problems due to the aging population. It will be interesting to see if the CCP leadership will be successful in its attempts to push up the birth rate. For now, its anti-feminist and LGBTIQ+ campaigns and conservative family policies make more resistance from women likely in the future. Fourth, on the political front, the current CCP regime under Xi Jinping. It's really unfortunate if I'm mispronouncing his name. I should know how to pronounce it. Which took power in 2012, has tried to consolidate state and party institutions through various reforms, fortifying party control over institutions, enterprises, and public life. For the time being, conflicts in the CCP leadership seem to be mitigated, as the factions around party leader Xi Jinping has been able to keep other factions in check. One measure employed by Xi Jinping's anti-graft campaign, which has led to the punishment of millions of public servants, while administrative dysfunctions and corruption have remained pervasive. Insecurity and discontent among party leaders make more leadership infighting likely, especially if Xi's faction proves unable to prevent economic and social turmoil. Footnote. The uprising in Hong Kong led to rumors about leadership conflicts and criticism of Xi Jinping's management of the Hong Kong crisis in 2019. End of footnote. Fifth, the CCP leadership under Xi Jinping favors repression as a means of maintaining control. It has intensified censorship and the criminalization of open disagreement and discontent, including frequent arrests of online activists and journalists. Control technologies in public spaces and on the internet, as well as the, quote, social credit system, are designed to track and punish deviant behavior. The province Xinjiang, I don't know how to pronounce that either, Xinjiang, serves as the CPC leadership's laboratory for repressive tools, including mass surveillance and detention, mostly of the province's Uyghur population. Some of these tools are increasingly used in other provinces and in Hong Kong. All this signifies the end of, quote, pragmatic authoritarianism, end quote, that characterizes the effort of previous CCP regimes to contain discontent and safeguard stability. The regime's flexibility in containing unrest, i.e., its ability to adapt its strategy by applying different forms of leadership and appropriately combining repression, concession, and co-optation, is, to say the least, hampered. Sixth, increased repression also risks leading to widespread alienation and anger. Social struggles of various actors have continued throughout the past years. Migrant workers have regularly gone out on strike, although not as frequently and visibly as in the late 2000s and early 2010s. They have suffered most from the COVID-19 pandemic and recent crises, particularly in terms of loss of wages and redundancies. However, migrant workers continue to demand a larger share of the wealth they produce and have gained experience in organizing and struggling. Meanwhile, the peasantry, while reducing in numbers, continues to live in even more difficult conditions than most people in the cities. Enclosures, growing agribusiness, land theft, corruption, and pollution might lead to new peasant revolts against the CCP regime at the local level. In general, the lower growth rates in the PRC in the past few years and the effects of the global crisis of 2020, including bankruptcies, unemployment, and wage arrears, could lead to a further deterioration in living conditions and another explosion of social conflicts, especially if the current crisis persists over a longer period. If the CCP leadership cannot deliver further social improvements, and if domestic or global crises undermine the livelihood of workers and peasants in the PRC, then the regime might face tough times. Seventh, the expansion of manufacturing, construction, and energy production, rapid urbanization, a massive increase in motorized traffic, and the lack of effective and environmental regulations and controls have led to immense environmental problems. They include the pollution and contamination of water, soil, and air, as well as pandemics and the spread of diseases connected to industrial farming and meat production. The CCP regime recognizes the hazards, especially as the urban middle class, the pillar of CCP support, now also faces additional health and quality of life difficulties, yet it has been unable to solve these problems despite its ongoing talk about green development. All these factors and developments combined pose an increasing challenge for the CCP leadership. Predictions are hard to make. Possible scenarios are the regime might come out of the current crisis and conflict strengthened and more or less maintain the status quo of CCP rule, or the CCP might be weakened and eventually implode in the face of economic turmoil, spatial segmentation, the, quote, balkanization of the country, and leadership conflicts. In the latter case, PRC capitalism might be succeeded by something even worse, or if things go well for workers, peasants, migrants, and women, the regime might finally crumble as a result of social uprisings and pressure from below, in which case there might be a chance to overcome capitalism and to build better economic, political, and social structures and relations. Footnote. For a scenario of a possible collapse of the PRC in the early 2020s due to economic, social, and political crisis, see Li Man-ki, China in the 21st Century Crisis. For a critique of that position, see Ralf Ruckus. Chinese Capitalism and Crisis, Part 2. Li Man-ki on the forthcoming collapse of China's economy and the capitalist world system. End of footnote. Window of instability. Capitalism cannot be abolished in one country. Capitalism is a complex, albeit asymmetrical global system. For the left and the PRC and elsewhere, it is vital to focus not only on domestic affairs but also on the state and development of the capitalist world system. In the recent past, this system has been unstable and changing. The history of capitalism shows that periods of systemic stability and development under a particular hegemonic power, such as Britain or the US, altered with periods of systemic instability and crises as upcoming powers battled to replace the hegemon. During more recent periods of instability, movements from below have had substantially better opportunities to produce or enforce change than during periods of systemic stability. In the 1930s, for instance, the working class in the upcoming world power of the United States were able to use the systemic instability due to economic crises and geopolitical challenges to win major concessions from U.S. capital and the state. Britain's hegemony finally ended with World War II and was followed by the confrontation between the, quote, West under U.S. leadership and the, quote, East led by the Soviet Union. During the Cold War era, from the 1950s to the 1970s, global social and partially revolutionary struggles, from workers' and peasants' movements in the global north to strikes, uprisings, and anti-colonial struggles in the global south, forced capitalist and socialist regimes to make substantial economic concessions and expand welfare programs that were in many countries similar to the Keynesian model created in the U.S. during the 1930s. The regimes also tried to co-opt leadership of such movements and struggles in an attempt to neutralize unrest from below. In most cases, economic concessions and the co-optation of leaders went hand in hand with the repression of social and political struggles that continued to pose a threat to both capitalist and socialist rule. Footnote. It is noteworthy that during the second half of the 20th century, major economic, social, and political ruptures around the world coincided with major ruptures in the PRC. The global social upheavals the late 1960s and early 1970s took place at the same time as the Cultural Revolution shook the PRC and triggered the transition process. Furthermore, the implosion of the Eastern Bloc, under the pressure from popular movements in the late 1980s and early 1990s, ran parallel to the Tiananmen Square movement. The crackdown in 1989, the subsequent completion of the PRC's transition to capitalism in the mid-1990s. End of footnote. At different times during the second half of the 20th century, it seemed that a socialist bloc around the Soviet Union, a united Europe, later the EU, or Japan would compete with the U.S. for global hegemony. However, it was the PRC that became an economic node for global production, the factory of the world. In the 1990s, even gaining the status of global economic and political force competing with the U.S., as is evident during and after the crisis in the late 2000s and early 2010s. This crisis started with a financial slump in the U.S. that was followed by a global recession in 2008 and 2009, as well as a wave of social struggles around the world between 2010 and 2012. At that time, the PRC's own social conflicts revealed the transformations in its class relations, the risk migrant worker strikes posed for the cheap labor export economy, and the importance of the PRC's migrant working class for global capitalism. Throughout the 2010s, global political and economic development was consistently volatile. The multifaceted crises around the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated the confrontation between the regimes in the U.S. and the PRC. We might well have reached another historical watershed, one comparable to the Great Depression, World War II, and the establishment of U.S. hegemony in the 1930s and 1940s, or to the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Eastern Bloc in the late 1980s and early 1990s. While earlier competitions for global hegemony have ended with one country taking the leading role, the New World Order in the making might not be dominated by one capitalist core country such as the U.S. or a contender such as the PRC. Rather, it is possible that the New World Order will be multipolar, with competition among alliances around the old U.S. hegemon, the European Union, the PRC, and India. Furthermore, it will likely feature repeated economic crises, environmental disasters, struggles over resources, mass movements of refugees and other migrants, social rebellions, authoritarian countermeasures, including increased surveillance and repression, nationalist or right-wing movements, xenophobia, and military conflicts. The outcome of such a development might well be the collapse of the capitalist world system as we know it. From a left-wing perspective, the decisive question is whether or not the new world disorder will still be capitalist, oppressive, and destructive. That will depend on the development of social and political struggles from below, their strength, their direction, and their ability to cross borders. In mid and late 2019, a new range of social struggles took place around the globe, mostly in countries in Latin America and different parts of Asia, including Hong Kong. The COVID-19 pandemic interrupted this cycle of struggles only to prepare the ground for a further explosion in the early summer 2020. The Black Lives Matter revolt against structural racism and police violence in the U.S. triggered mobilizations in other countries that also responded to growing social inequality and class conflicts. While the social tensions created by the different forms of capitalism continue to lead to waves of discontent, there has not been a clear tendency within any of the recent movements to actually join forces and create a coherent global class movement. Footnote. This is not to say the struggles that have not connected, communicated, circulated, or produced copycats. The point here is that they have not produced coherent mobilizations in different parts of the world that developed into a global class movement. End of footnote. The systemic instability both in the PRC and globally, the new social revolts, and the faltering legitimacy of capitalist economy and governments worldwide open new possibilities and perspectives for fundamental change. Yet the lack of cohesion and cross-border empowerment of social struggles exposes the biggest challenge for the movements and a global left concerned with ending capitalist exploitation, sexist and racist discrimination, and other forms of oppression. To be up to these challenges, the political left in the global south and global north need to deal with their past. Both leftist grand narratives, social democracy and Marxism-Leninism, including Maoism, have failed and had led to historical impasses in recent decades. In the PRC and elsewhere, the left can learn from the failures of socialist movements and of actually existing socialism and use these lessons to find an alternative strategy for toppling the current system. Implications. Section 3. Implications. Lessons for the left. This section argues for an analytical and organizational adjustment of left-wing politics. The first part briefly reassesses the factors that led to the failure of the CCP's socialism, underlines the centrality of social movements from below for any meaningful change, and describes the left's possible catalyst role for such change. The second part calls for the abandonment of the two leftist grand narratives of the 20th century which have both failed, Marxism-Leninism and social democracy. The third part discusses elements of an alternative left-wing approach to social struggle and historical change. It considers the various lessons from the trajectory of the PRC and the CCP and combines them with experiences of recent social movements elsewhere. The fourth part proposes concrete strategies left-wing actors could employ to support social struggles and organizing in the PRC and elsewhere. Looking back, looking forward. Since the CCP regime is not as stable as it wants us to believe, and as the current global instability offers opportunities for social movements from below to transform and topple capitalism, what does this mean for the left and its strategies to push for social change? The trajectory of the CCP rule in the PRC during the transitional period in the early 1950s and the socialist period thereafter offers important indications. the CCP set up an exploitative socialist economy that did not break with central elements of the previous system. It reconfigured and did not abolish forms of exclusion, discrimination, and violence, and it established a repressive system against social struggles and political opposition. The CCP, as an organization, replicated hierarchical top-down structures, and its cadres formed the core of the socialist ruling class. Quote, revolutionary nostalgia regarding the PRC socialist period is therefore misplaced. The period from the 1970s until the 1990s was transitional, and the period thereafter does not qualify as socialist in any case. In fact, the CCP's regime claim that the PRC is still socialist today is a mockery of proletarian movements and left-wing activists fighting back against exploitation and repression in the country. While the left can draw lessons from the experiences in the PRC, it is important to understand that the organized political left itself is not the main force that is producing meaningful change. Looking at the history of global capitalism and left-wing organizations makes it clear that there is no point in expecting any substantial material improvements or fundamental change without large social movements and strong pressure from below. Such movements and their empowerment are not the result of optimal left-wing organizing or leadership, but a range of economic, social, and political factors. In the PRC, such factors have at times produced massive, powerful social movements. These had their own limitations, both political and organizational, and were not able to effectively deal with the containment measures or co-optation, concession, and repression from above. No movement or broader left-wing mobilization brought about profound and lasting transformations that went beyond the socialist or capitalist framework. That might change, though, and an organized political left could function as a catalyst inside movements, support their progressive elements, and help them succeed in the PRC and elsewhere. If the left wants to play this catalyst role in overcoming capitalism, it needs to explore practices and opportunities for a revolutionary process. Revolution, not as a coup and taking over political power from the top, but as the destruction of capitalist, patriarchal, and other oppressive relations, structures, and practices, and the establishment of new forms of production, reproduction, administration, and sociality. Failure of leftist grand narratives. Marxism-Leninism, including Maoism, and social democracy are the main leftist currents that came out of the social struggles and political organizing in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century. These currents are very different when it comes to political strategies and goals, but they share certain features. Organizations in both currents have been hierarchical, developed party and union aristocracies, and have adjusted their originally more militant or even subversive strategies when they came to power, and both failed to topple capitalism as previously promised. Capitalist forces, as well as right-wing and liberal political groups looking to defend the capitalist status quo, have played an important role here, but it is also the adjustment process and the contradictions of both currents that the left needs to analyze if it wants to avoid making the same strategic mistakes in the future. The Marxist-Leninist model was implemented mostly by socialist or communist parties in peripheral and semi-peripheral states that attempted to launch a catch-up development, often in the form of a development dictatorship. In quotes. In the PRC, the CCP's socialism also built upon the Marxist-Leninist conception of history, according to which socialism is understood as the transitory phase between capitalism and communism, the phase where capitalist structures are destroyed and replaced and where conditions are prepared for a communist society. Yet the dominant versions of Marxism-Leninism omit, ignore, or fail to realize that this process might be and has been stopped and reversed by conflicts or failures. Indeed, the PRC's arrived at just such an impasse, not by accident, but as the result of the intrinsic contradictions of the socialist setup in the country. The CCP's socialism was not a system and society under the control of workers and peasants. The original revolutionary promise of destroying the capitalist class system and all forms of repression and replacing it with one based on collectivity and equality was not achieved. Instead, a new class rule based on economic exploitation, state repression, patriarchal discrimination, and social exclusion was established. What is more, while Maoism was meant to lead to communism, in reality it prepared the conditions for the transition to capitalism. Compared to the Maoist variation, the socialism developed in the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries shared central features, particular forms of class rule, authoritarian statehood, and patriarchy. Unlike the PRC, the Soviet version faltered at the end of the 1980s, and the Communist parties lost their position in power. This demise led to the development of capitalist social relations under new class rule, as part of the old socialist ruling class often formed the base of the new capitalist class, and the integration of the previously socialist countries into global capitalism. Social democracy, the other main leftist grand narrative of the 20th century, has been mostly promoted by socialist or social democratic parties in capitalist core states. In these states, the ruling classes could afford to share the wealth produced with a certain part of the population and grant democratic participation rights without risking social and political instability. The historical balance sheet of social democracy does not look good either, given that social democratic forces have been successfully integrated into capitalist ruling classes in many countries, for instance in Europe. Keynesian crisis management, welfare reforms, and liberal representative democracy did not work to overcome capitalist exploitation. Instead, they reinforced the structures and mechanisms of capitalist exploitation, class rule, and the global imperialist order, and they helped to control or co-opt social movements and resistance and repress radical political forces behind them. According to the social democratic narrative in the PRC, economic development, industrialization, urbanization, and rising income for a substantial part of the population should have led to political reforms and the establishment of democratic institutions of social representation. This is the case in large parts of Western Europe, or more recently in countries such as South Korea and Brazil. Democratic forces inside and outside the PRC hoped for such a development, especially in the 1980s when the official reforms started, in the 1990s when reforms were relaunched, and in the 2000s when the PRC joined the World Trade Organization. At times, even parts of the CCP leadership seemed to be playing with ideas of democratization. However, there has not been a development towards a socialist democracy, and at this stage it does not seem likely in the future. Even were it to happen, the result of such a democratization would not take the PRC beyond capitalism, but at best to a kind of green capitalism as proposed by social democratic circles in the ruling classes of core capitalist centers, including the United States and the European Union. In sum, both Maoism and other forms of Marxism-Leninism, as well as social democracy, fail to overcome capitalism. The global left needs to find alternative strategies that deliver profound social change and empower the social forces able to accomplish this goal. Key aspects of left-wing politics. Key aspects of left-wing politics. The structures and dynamics that let the socialist project and the PRC fail have been summed up above: repressive state forms, continuation of exploitation, gender division of labor, discrimination against migrants, hierarchical and authoritarian organizations, nationalism, and more. When discussing a different approach that avoids these shortcomings, a broad range of issues covering economy, ecology, politics, inclusion, exclusion, organizing, and struggle need to be discussed. What follows is a short list of central aspects of left-wing politics that try to avoid pitfalls of the past while staying focused on the aim of overcoming all forms of exploitation and oppression. The aim is not to develop abstract ideas, but to seize upon tendencies that have been in one way or another already deployed and developed in recent movements. Abolish capitalism. Looking beyond Marxism-Leninism and social democracy, the aim of a new attempt should neither be a form of actually existing socialism nor a tamed or green capitalism, but the final abolition of exploitation and state oppression, i.e. of private ownership of the means of production, capital accumulation and appropriation, capitalist technology, the hierarchical organization of labor and society, and all forms of exclusion and discrimination. Exploitation, authoritarian state rule, corruption, exclusion, and repression were targeted in many of the upheaval strikes and square occupations in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in the late 2000s and early 2010s. They are part of a new era of global mass struggle that began in the early 2000s and continue more recently with further outbreaks in various countries in 2019, for example, Chile, Lebanon, Iraq, France, and Hong Kong. In 2020, for example, Black Lives Matter in the United States and elsewhere, and women's movements like the one against the anti-abortion laws in Poland. Many of these movements show a high degree of self-organization, some are even practically leaderless, but most are still dominated by reformist ideas or have not broken with social democratic or Marxist-Leninist concepts. Ensure sustainability. Capitalism and socialism have followed different forms of productivism and aim for endless economic growth. This has led to immense environmental destruction and the waste of natural resources. Today, the economy needs to be reconfigured and brought into accord with sustainable development that avoids ecological crises and disaster. This cannot be done with a green capitalism that uses allegedly eco-friendly technologies such as those currently employed for electric vehicles and solar power to continue on the path of capitalist growth. Ecological movements in the East and West have highlighted disaster-prone productivism since the 1970s and 1980s. More recently, mobilizations against climate change have demanded an end to environmental destruction. However, in the past decades, ecological movements have regularly been pacified and co-opted. Green parties and policies have played a similar role in the promotion of structural and technological reforms of capitalist production as social democratic parties and policies did in the 20th century. Therefore, it remains to be seen whether the current mobilizations will be able to develop and maintain an anti-capitalist agenda. Go beyond state power. Both leftist grand narratives assume that only by taking state power could capitalism be controlled and then abolished, but instead, leftist governments reinforced or established more or less authoritarian and repressive state regimes. These have functioned to stabilize socialist or capitalist structures and secure the position of the ruling classes. For the abolition or substitution of the authoritarian and repressive state, alternative structures need to be built based on collective egalitarian and anti-authoritarian forms of administration and decision-making. These alternative structures of administration have to deal with counter-revolutionary forces and anti-working class, sexist, and racist actors or movements. Historical experience shows that authoritarian socialist forms of dealing with them have led to new forms of oppression. Historical experience has shown that authoritarian socialist forms of dealing with them have led to new forms of oppression and exploitation. New revolutionary attempts need to develop other strategies to fight back against defenders of the old class order, while avoiding the development of new revolutionary attempts need to develop other strategies to fight back against defenders of the old class order, while avoiding the development of new class order. Left-wing initiatives and social movements have regularly distrusted and criticized leftist governments and socialist state structures, especially after the formation of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, after the crackdowns in Hungary and Poland in the mid-1950s, during the Cultural Revolution in the PRC, and the 1968 movements elsewhere, and after the consolidation of leftist regimes in post-colonial countries in the global south. However, taking state power is still a key aim and strategy of many leftist initiatives, mobilizations, and parties. Going beyond Western democracy. When criticizing or confronting authoritarian regimes, socialist or not, left-wing forces frequently present Western or representative democracy as a better option. Western democracy, prevailing mostly in the global north, is a form of capitalist rule despite the civil liberties granted to those with citizenship rights. Movements that seek to overcome capitalism need to fight for the empowerment of social actors from below in the global south and the global north, as well as for an egalitarian political and economic system that allows people to collectively control their lives. Footnote. Equally problematic is the discourse on human rights, at least as long as social inequality and capitalist exploitation remain excluded from discourse on human rights. End footnote. The limits of representative democracy have been criticized since it became an important political form of capitalist rule in the early 20th century, for instance, by anarchist and feminist groups, by various grassroots movements in the 1960s and 1970s, and in the early 2010s during the square movements with their forms of direct democracy. Especially when movements face authoritarian regimes, representative democracy seems the better alternative or a step in the right direction. In reality, it offers restricted participation rights to a limited number of people, mostly in the global north, while strengthening and legitimizing a global capitalist and imperialist order in which the majority of people continue to live under authoritarian regimes. Destroy national borders. While establishing socialist internationals consisting of socialist, social democratic, or communist parties and using internationalist rhetoric, both leftist grand narratives have been based on nationalist conceptions of state citizenship, national development, and political, economic, and social organizations within established national borders. What we need is a global conception of social and political struggle that crosses and eventually destroys the national borders, that divides social resistance and protect capitalist interests, attempts to build solidarity across borders, infused anti-colonial debates and struggles throughout the 20th century, and shaped the so-called anti-globalization movements in the 2000s as well as the rebellions of the early 2010s. Still, many left-wing debates, mobilizations, and organizations continue to focus on the nation-state or even promote a kind of leftist nationalism. Fight racist exclusion. Socialist states and capitalist states under social democratic governments have made use of national citizenship as well as ethnic, cultural, and class differences to establish discriminatory migration regimes, i.e. policies and practices that isolate, exclude, or oppress rural migrants or immigrants, strip them of resources, exploit them, punish them, and extradite them. Movements from below have also relied on racism to exclude others from certain rights or benefits based on race, culture, religion, and citizenship status. Migrants, whether violently forced to migrate or motivated by poverty or other factors, have long played an important part in the making of working classes globally, for instance, since the late 19th century in the U.S. and since the late 20th century in the PRC. People of color have been at the forefront of the struggle against discrimination and for inclusion, most recently as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yet despite anti-racist struggles and pressure, racism continues to poison many left-wing social mobilizations today. Abolish gender discrimination. Neither socialist nor social democratic regimes have ended patriarchal oppression. Since the 19th century, these regimes have only made partial concessions under pressure from women's and LGBTQ plus struggles. At the same time, they adapted and reconfigured patriarchal structures and practices in such a way that they meet the needs of the socialist or capitalist economy. Thus, women were temporarily given wage labor, primarily as exploitable, precarious, low-wage workers, while simultaneously securing society's social reproduction needs through unwaged labor. Any future society has to reorganize the forms and distribution of social reproduction and abolish gender discrimination and oppression altogether. Since the 1960s and 1970s, women's movements have pushed for the change of gender relations in many parts of the world, yet the feminist revolution is far from over, and many social movements and left-wing initiatives still reproduce gender division of labor and other elements of the patriarchal and heteronormative order. Eliminate hierarchical structures. Past and present left-wing organizations such as labor unions, political parties, and NGOs have been organized top-down, replicating boss-worker or teacher-student structures and at times racist and or sexist divisions. The authoritarian practice often coincides with another hierarchical form of allegedly educated, professional, enlightened organization representatives and allegedly uneducated, amateur, ignorant target groups or audiences. leadership, privileges, and income inequality are justified by political aims or organizational necessities. Since the 19th century, rank-and-file members of left-wing organizations have fought for equal participation in decision-making against authoritarian and corrupt leaders. More recently, the improved access to education and communication technologies, as well as the accumulated experiences of collectivity, cooperation, and exchange, have enabled grassroots initiatives to increasingly surpass centralized and hierarchical structures. In the ecological movement, in wildcat strikes, in the women's movement, and in anti-racist mobilizations, still, concepts of hierarchical left-wing organizing and leadership myths continue to be promoted in social movements from below, especially by those who want to be leaders themselves. Prevent co-optation. Left-wing actors from different currents have long fought for material improvements and the abolition of capitalist exploitation and gender oppression. Many of them have been silenced through repression, have given up after concessions, or have joined the other side by surrendering or being co-opted. Co-optation undermines the functioning of a movement by coercing, bribing, or seducing activists or leaders to switch sides, and by using their experience to adapt regime structures and practices and avoid further resistance and destabilization. Footnote. For an analysis of how different forms of formal coercion and of informal or hidden mechanisms of political control are employed by the CCP regime, for instance, through cultivating civil society or co-opting local leaders or infiltration, see Daniel C. Mattingly, The Art of Political Control in China. For a more general debate on the dynamics of social movements and activism and their co-option and pacification, see Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed and How They Fail. End of footnote. Social movements need a strategy to limit or prevent co-optation, for instance by establishing collective forms of grassroots decision-making and control, and by keeping those who are likely to be co-opted away from central functions in movements and organizations. Attempts have been made to prevent co-optation in many social movements around the globe, but it still functions as an important ruling class tool for suppressing social unrest. Footnote. When protagonists of the two leftist grand narratives and currents were co-opted by the ruling classes in both socialist and capitalist systems, their backgrounds in the upper middle or educated classes often enabled them to reintegrate into their class of origin and choose a career in political or economic organizations. Their experience as activists or leaders in left-wing or social movements often proved instrumental for their integration. Taken together, these central political and strategic aspects of left-wing politics contradict left-wing currents. Their experience in activism or leaders in left-wing or social movements often proved instrumental for their integration. End of footnote. I forgot to end the footnote. Taken together, these central political and strategic aspects of left-wing politics contradict left-wing currents that seek to reform capitalism, try to infiltrate capitalist state structures, or to change them from inside, or try to take state power through a coup at the top. Elements of a left-wing strategy. How do the key aspects of left-wing politics described above translate into a practical strategy for change locally and globally? Two forms of activity are vital, traces of which can be found throughout the history of revolutionary politics in China and elsewhere. The analysis of the process of class recomposition from the perspective of proletarians and other oppressed people in forms of organizing from below, which break down the divisions between proletarians, activists, and so-called intellectuals. Footnote. A useful conception that combines analysis and organizing in this way was developed in Italy in the 1960s and termed con ricerca. It was later used in other parts of the world too. See Raniero Pensieri's Socialist Uses of Workers' Inquiry. End of footnote. The following paragraphs identify a few central elements of a left-wing strategy for analysis and organizing. Some readers might have already integrated some of these elements into their own political strategy. Others could take them as an inspiration for new attempts. A special focus is given to solidarity and supportive movements in the PRC. Act locally, and globally. Abolishing capitalism means abolishing capitalism globally. While remaining involved in local or regional struggles, left-wing activists outside the PRC should make the social conflicts in the PRC part of their perspective and analysis and read about workers' experiences and women's struggles and migrants' resistance in particular. Those inside the PRC should look elsewhere for inspiration and support. Dump nationalist discourses. In the U.S. and the European Union, political forces from the right and left evoke a kind of, quote, yellow peril, to block PRC influence abroad and push for the national interest of their country. Meanwhile, other parts of the left side with the CCP regime, while ignoring its attacks on social unrest in the PRC and its attempts to set up its own imperialist system. Both forms of support for imperialist powers, whether old or new, are weakening the struggle of social movements and working classes. Left-wing practices should fight nationalist discourses and aim for a form of globalism from below. Avoiding left-wing mystification. The mystification and glorification of past or current movements common among leftists produces twisted historical images of struggles, organizations, and individuals. Misleading ideology or propaganda, for instance, on the great leader Mao Zedong or the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat produces confusion and distrust and makes movements politically vulnerable. The left needs an open discussion on the strengths and weaknesses of social revolts and collective resistance, i.e. potentials and limitations of their organizational texture, their analysis and orientation, and their actual power, not only regarding the PRC. Organize without hierarchies. Social struggles and left-wing initiatives need collective organizing without hierarchies to prevent a gulf between membership and leadership, as well as to prevent the, quote, sellout of social movements by their, quote, leaders. This form of organizing contrasts with that of the traditional hierarchical unions, parties, or NGOs that have been instrumental in the co-optation, integration, and pacification of social resistance and have often undermined the self-empowerment of social actors. Keep grassroots actors in control. In the PRC and elsewhere, it is often, quote, professionals like union bureaucrats, NGO staff, academics, and journalists who try to determine the form and direction of social struggles. By overcoming this kind of paternalism, left-wing organizing and struggle should be in the hands of, quote, proletarian social actors, i.e. workers, women, migrants, students, and pensioners who are actually at the front of social conflicts. They should represent themselves in the struggle and its reporting and analysis. Footnote. That is not to say that union or NGO staff, journalists, and academics who sympathize with social movements should not support social struggles, but they should not take a leading role or decide on the aims, forms, tools, or objectives of these struggles, unless the struggle concerns social conflicts within NGOs, unions, media, or universities, nor should they mix their involvement with professional, career, and business aims. End of footnote. Organize solidarity that empowers. The aim of solidarity should not be to to represent particular movements or social actors, but to facilitate processes of self-empowerment. With regards to social struggles in the PRC, this can take different forms, creating links with and between social activists in the PRC and elsewhere, giving voice to oppositional forces and labor conflicts, feminist struggles, or other social clashes, supporting those who are subject to state prosecution and other forms of repression, scrutinizing and criticizing PRC or CCP involvement and influence in institutions in your area, for instance, companies or universities, providing resources in the form of know-how, money, technology, translation, and media access. The latter is particularly important in countries like the PRC, where movements and initiatives are faced with oppression and censorship by an authoritarian regime, low wages, and other factors that limit people's abilities to organize and act. These are conceptual ideas that could serve as guiding principles for left-wing organizing and intervention in social struggles in the PRC and elsewhere. The aim is to develop left-wing practices that are superseding and not affirmative, collective and not hierarchical, effective and not fleeting. In short, quote, rather than providing the right left-wing repair kit for the disintegration of capitalist social structure. In short, quote, rather than providing the right left-wing repair kit for the disintegrating capitalist social structure, greasing the cogs of arbitration and pacification of social struggles, or even reinventing the myth of a workers' state, the left should further engage in and support the class-making processes by breaking state censorship and spreading more information about struggles in the PRC and beyond, and by refraining from its constructive role within the limits of capitalism and forging tools of destructive critiques. This form of critique has to look through state propaganda as well as the fog around capitalist exploitation and shed light on struggles that can open perspectives beyond capitalism. End quote. The Friends of Gong Chao. Left Dead End Street versus Destructive Critique, China's Counterinsurgency Policies and How to Respond. End of footnote. Epilogue. Over the past 7 decades, the CCP regime developed a sophisticated party and state structure. The CCP used it to adapt to changes and challenges, and eventually to master the transition and reach the end of the communist road to capitalism. The regime has shown an astonishing ability to deal with social and political unrest, while retaining a certain level of popular support. Yet in recent decades, we have seen several other seemingly stable regimes crumble after popular uprisings and revolts. For instance, in the late 1980s in Eastern Europe, or in the early 2010s in North Africa, and today, the CCP regime itself is not as stable as it is often presented to be. Escalating economic crises and regime failures could further lower its legitimacy, and workplace conflicts, women's struggles, and migrants' discontent might undermine its rule. Therefore, it remains to be seen whether capitalism in the PRC will survive, but as long as it does, revolution will stay on the agenda. Revolution as the process of creating a society that is under the control of the people and based on the people's needs and not the wealth and profits for the ruling class. This book focuses on the trajectory of the PRC, yet any debate about revolution must address the making and composition of a global working class. Cycles of social struggle have frequently developed in different parts of the world, most recently between 2010 and 2012, and again in 2019. Whether organized by migrants, urban workers, peasants, students, or women, most of these social struggles occurred concurrently, but were not actually global. Rather, they were still divided along north-south lines and by national labor markets, sexism, racism, and migration regimes. These divisions can be overcome, and it is one of the tasks of left-wing organizing to provide resources and create bridges that connect struggles across divisions and borders so they can eventually become global. Central to the success of any new revolutionary effort is whether or not its protagonists are able to learn from the mistakes made during previous attempts. This book maps and analyzes the contradictions of socialism and capitalism in the PRC. In its conclusion, it discusses elements of an alternative strategy for preparing a new revolutionary attempt. If the book's narrative and analysis can trigger a wider debate along this line, it was worth all the headache, time, and energy. Controversies, commentaries, reviews, and material related to the book are documented on the website gongchao.org. Another book that takes up the main threads laid down here is in the works. The title, The Left in China, traces the main social uprisings and movements in the PRC since the 1950s and discusses the left-wing political positions and concepts developed in these struggles. Books and website seek to open up a critical debate on the history and future of revolutionary politics in the PRC and beyond. Please join in if you haven't already. Exclamation point.